I'm Ed Nersessian. I'm director of the center. Today's program is on shame. Before I introduce the participants, I should tell you that the next program in June is on status, and then in September we have a program on a roundtable on lying. And then we are working on other roundtables, including on suicide. So I'm going to be very brief with the introductions. The full biography of the participants is on the website, but I have a printed version here that I can send around, and you can just pass it around if you want. Joseph Adamson is Professor Emeritus of English from McMaster University. Richard Schroeder is the Harold Higgins Swift Distinguished Service Professor, Department of Comparative Human Development, University of Chicago. Michael Lewis is the University Distinguished Professor of Pediatrics and Psychiatry, Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. The program was suggested to me by Kathy O'Neill, who is there, and she's a mathematician and founder of ORCAA. So, open for you to start.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming. Can everyone hear me? I think it's very important to speak loudly and clearly. And I'm going to be kind of like the dumbest person here because I am a mathematician and an author and a data scientist. I wrote a book about how data science is fucking up democracy. And then I decided to write another book about shame, and I have really no right to do so. And I'm so grateful for these distinguished professors to come tell me what I've got it wrong about it. So I was just hoping that we could start by talking about what we mean by shame, the definition, and then I would love to jump in and say all the bad ideas I have about it so I could be corrected. But maybe we'll just start by, if you guys are into it, talk about what we mean by shame. And for me, it's probably the best to say that I think of shame as something I am rather than something I did. So it's not guilt. Guilt is something I feel bad about. I could apologize and it would be over, potentially. Shame is something that is like a sort of a deeper meaning about my worthiness. Am I worthy of something? So for me, the sort of deep experience of shame probably came from my parents fat shaming me. For years and years, I was told I was unattractive, would never get married, would never be worthy of attention from men. And that was sort of my first sort of inhabiting of shame, which I sort of think of there as being a sort of 4 stages of shame. The first stage is just inhabiting shame, feeling ashamed on a daily basis. Not always terribly shamed, like sometimes worse than others, but, just sort of feeling, yes, I am unworthy. That is inhabiting shame, the first stage. The second stage happened when I was a teenager and I met people who didn't mind my body and thought actually I was attractive. And so I was sort of like a different context, a different group of people around me that didn't have the norm that I was unattractive. When I went back to my family and to my high school friends and they shamed me again for my body, it provoked a different kind of experience for me, which I call outrage and denial. I was outraged by that. I was like, I don't deserve that. And yet it did make me feel shame. So it sort of both pushed me back into stage 1 and also gave me this new experience of stage 2. And I'll just briefly say for me, the stage 3, which I call facing the facts, is what came much later when I was an adult, when I had 3 children, and I had all the sex I wanted from all the men I wanted. And I was like, wait, hold on a second. They actually were lying to me. It was wrong on its face. The facts were wrong. So that's called stage 3 for me, like facing my personal facts, saying, wait a second, turn off the noise, turn off the Weight Watchers, the industry is trying to profit from me, the people trying to maintain power because they're attractive and I'm not. Ignore all that. What are my actual facts at hand? And that's what I call stage 3, facing the facts. And then stage 4, for me, is when I ultimately think it's not about me anymore. It's about saying, what the heck are we doing to people, to children, by shaming them for their bodies. That's when you sort of see it from the outside. And I'll stop there because I've already provoked. So I'm sure you guys have all said something. Yeah, go.
Can everyone hear me with this device on? Well, let me try a definition that I think overlaps with yours, and then I'd like to put out a proposition and give an illustration. And I also think we're going to have to introduce different kinds of societies, because your description of your experience and relationship to it, I think, comes from a particular kind of subculture in which creative individualism, liberation, and a big focus on self is privileged over a lot of other ways of thinking about society. I take it your parents were actually trying to instruct you in success and status and the norms of society when they were doing that, and the capacity to actually reject it, seems to me a separate issue from an analysis of shame per se. I would say shame is something like the fear of being seen as defective by others. And it can take many variations, and what the defects are can vary. I want to propose that shame and perhaps embarrassment are more powerful motivators of behavior than the fear of death. And the example I would give would be, let's say, if you go back to 1889, there were the Zulu Wars in South Africa, and the British had machine guns and knew how to fire rifles. And they killed a lot of Zulus. But those Zulus who went on and fought them for 6 months would start with a group of 5 buddies in a village. They would create a bond between themselves. They actually would vomit into a pit, put the collective vomit in a gourd, which each of them wore around their necks, and would run in beautiful coordinated ways into battle 15 miles away to sure death. They knew they were going to be killed. And the machine guns were there and mowed them down. Gallipoli is another example in which I think the fear of shame or not showing courage or not being there with your buddies is more powerful than the fear of death. There are lots of social situations, of course, in which shaming is extremely powerful. Lois Peake, who has studied preschools in Japan, for example, describes the classroom in 4 and 5-year-olds in Japan. The teacher walks in, the kids are sitting there and say, "Teacher, we are ready to learn mathematics." And the teacher could look around and say, "But so-and-so doesn't have his book with him today. No one can learn mathematics today." And that night, the mother or parents of that kid who didn't bring his book are going to hear from every other mother around and be powerfully shamed into making sure that they bring that book to school. And of course, this is one of the ways in which the social order is carried forward. People have a sense of shame. We don't want someone to be shameless, okay? In fact, in the community I work in India, which is an Orthodox Hindu temple town, to be full of shame is to have propriety, to be civilized, to understand the rules. It's an extremely powerful and positive kind of cultivation of self-restraint, for example, and an understanding of the status structures that are there, and a willingness to play the part within this choreography of a hierarchical, interrelated set of statuses. And you're going to hear about it if you start deviating from that. Anyway, that's my first pass.
I'm very struck by what Kathy was saying, because I'm working on The Mill and the Floss right now, George Eliot. And there's a little girl, focus of the story, the novel, and she's relentlessly shamed as a child because her complexion is the wrong color, her hair is too dark, her personality is too big. I mean, she has very intense emotions and strong attachments. So she's breaking all the norms in that society, to go back to what Rick was saying. It becomes very crushing for her. It's actually an amazing novel in terms of how shame works and how destructive it can be, although it can be a very positive affect too. It's a corrective. It can be a corrective in the right situation. Then her family has an economic downfall, sort of social disgrace. So it's a kind of piling on of shame for her. Because she's a girl, she's restricted, so she's constantly being shamed just for her gender. The novel ends very tragically because she finally experiences that kind of outrage you're talking about and acts on it impulsively and elopes with a young man who is, she's from a lower class. She elopes with a higher class gentleman, and basically the idea is she disgraces her family. She's ostracized. She can find no way of getting out of this impasse in her society, and the novel ends quite tragically. But there are more positive versions of that story in Eliot too, where it is a motivator, a very strong motivator for what Sylvan Tompkins calls, restoring the good scene. Because I find his work quite interesting because he sees it as the least punishing of the negative affects, as long as it's not magnified, because inherent in it is a desire to get back to those good feelings, the sort of positive feelings in the positive scene. So it can be a remarkable motivating force in human life. I think the real problem is when it becomes toxic, when it's relentless and magnified, when someone's growing up. Then it becomes problematic because you internalize it. And it's very difficult to break that internalization and to find a new way to be. So it struck me very much, the story you were telling there. It's very much like, you might enjoy reading. I don't know if you've read it, Eliot, but...
I have, yeah.
Yes.
Great.
You see what I'm saying? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, please. Well, it's, as Yogi Berra said, it's a deja vu all over again. I was in this room perhaps 25 years ago, and the topic was shame. So it's a persistent and an important topic.
Well, because, as I mentioned earlier, I think we're becoming a massive shame culture,
Wow.
and that may be why it's back.
Well, it's certainly the case. I had written a book called Shame, the Exposed Self, which in the area of human development and psychology and emotion that I work in, it was both a synthesis and an attempt to produce a theory, a testable theory, because the coinage that gets you ahead in my part of the world is you need to subject this to proof. It could be logical proof, but more an empirical. And it's a topic in emotional development, which, interestingly enough, Darwin, I just wrote a chapter for someone on Darwin's treatment of shame. I knew Sylvan well, and we spent a year having lunch together. Sylvan only ate 2 orders of coleslaw for the entire year. And I also tell you another thing about Sylvan. And Damon Uranian, the professor who goes to the horse races, is Sylvan Tompkins, modeled after him. So Sylvan was a wonderful a creature. He wrote 2 of the most incomprehensible volumes that I've read, but it generated a lot of thought and interest. But I really think if we want to, from a historical point of view, we should go back to Darwin and read Darwin. Darwin came close. The major problem Darwin had is he could not create a theory of the mind, cognition. So even in emotion, he moved to the measurement of blushing, which he claimed was a good measure of it. Part of Darwin's problems, as we know, was he had trouble with a gradualism. He had trouble going from animals, or primates, to humans. And in fact, he toyed with, and it's in his time was considered not inappropriate, but we do, both people of color and people with an intellectual disability, he saw as a middle group between great apes and humans. And he toyed with that idea about the emotions. His major problem was he couldn't distinguish between what he called and I call the self-conscious emotions, which we've touched on, which includes guilt, which includes embarrassment, which includes shame. And if we like, we could also include hubris, which turns out to be, in the English language, we have one word for pride, and that's pride goeth before the fall, which is a negative attribute, and proud of one's accomplishments, which is consider a motivator and a positive. So we only have one word for it. So hubris is probably an attempt of mine to try to move us away to have two words for the pride we're talking about. It turns out that within the psychoanalytic tradition, the confusion between shame and guilt has been enormous, and it's probably wasn't until the periods when I was writing and several analysts were writing. Nathanson was a derivative thinker, but he clearly was catching on to the idea that you had to make a distinction between them. In the meeting that I attended, I sort of sat back, it's unusual for me, and let the analyst talk about what they meant by shame and guilt. And of course, if we did this with what we mean by shame, we would come up with many definitions. So we know it's important, and we know, moreover, that we have to take culture into account. Darwin had another idea, and he talked about things which he called action patterns. So I'm going to make a ridiculous proposal to suggest that we don't learn shame. Shame is an action pattern, and it's set off by the instigators are thoughts about the self. And thoughts about the self are called self-attribution, and that self-attributions of a certain kind are likely to lead to certain emotional states, motivators of action. And I think Rick picked up that the idea of shame as an extremely negative emotion is questionable. Shame has clearly a very definite function. Clearly, one of the functions of shame is it stops you dead in your tracks. You suddenly developed a damaged self, and you have to do something about that. Guilt, on the other hand, does not lead to a damaged self. It leads to reparation. And so if you wanted to measure it, and since I'm interested in how it starts, I look at children, I can measure what a child does when they fail at something. They know they failed. And there's some children who try to repair the failure. There's some children who collapse. And there's some children who, in fact, don't show any of these negative, self-conscious like emotions. But I want to tell you of...
What do you think the action pattern is, specifically?
Okay, what is the action
I
pattern?
would have said it's hiding.
Well, I think
Getting away from the public
I think you're
gaze.
absolutely, but it's stopping. And there Sylvan had some idea, he called it interruption, but it's not interruption is the consequence of the act. That's the consequence of the action pattern is to stop you. Hiding is another way, is part of the stopping. So I would certainly agree that hiding, we measure it by, in fact, the collapse of the body, which is an attempt to hide the self. The phenomenological experience is I want to die, hide, and disappear, or die. So it is clearly a self inhibited. But let me give you this example, because one of the things that I've discovered in 60 years of studying this is it's very, very tricky. And I've come to a much greater appreciation with people trying to think about it in a more dynamic way. When you study it, you have to stop it and look what just happened. So let me give you a story that years ago a patient told me. He was driving a car. It was at night. It was on a lonely road. It was raining and very hard to see anything. And as he's driving, he hits a dog, runs in front of him, and he hits that dog. He slams on the brake, and his first thoughts are, what a horrible person I am. I've just killed a dog. Now, he doesn't like to have that thought and the action pattern associated with it. So he says, how do I get out of this? I mean, he doesn't say it literally, but very quickly he decides, one, he's not the cause of this mishap, this failure. Why? Because it's raining and it's dark, and moreover, the owner let the dog run wild. So all of a sudden, he starts off with this powerful self-crunching action pattern, but given the flexibility that we humans have, we can change our mind. We can reinterpret it. And indeed, what he does is he blames another. Now, the interesting thing, if it becomes a personality, namely one constantly in a situation in which the self might be injured, constantly reinterprets into other attributions. Essentially, it's either not my fault. By the way, males are much more likely to use it than females. The attribution is, it's not my fault. I'm sorry, it's not my fault. Females tend to use the attribution, it is my fault, more. But the fact of the matter is that I think the example characterizes that in front of us is what I call standards, rules, and goals. These are cultural events that are taught. These have no unique content. However, when one has in the self-attribution the capacity to think about oneself, and that's a whole nother story on the development of that. But having that capacity, you enter into a chain, a process, and depending on the outcome of that process, you end up with the kind of action pattern that I'm trying to describe. So,
Let me jump in,
let me
because
stop.
I think this is going to be one of several cases where we're going to have to be very clear about the boundary conditions we put about any generalizations we make. Because the mode of construal that you just described is not going to be readily available, for example, in that Hindu temple town where I've been working for several decades. Because there's not going to be the capacity to blame others or to see yourself as a victim. The reasoning is going to be, you always reap what you sow in life. And anything that happens is a consequence of your prior actions. And you come into the world with spiritual debts, and what you're doing constantly in life is trying to reduce the spiritual debts you have, because the more spiritual debts you have, the more likely you're going to be in the kind of circumstance you described. The very fact that it was a rainy day and someone let their thing out happened to you. Why did that happen to me? It happened to me because of my past behavior and the spiritual debts that I bring in. And so you're constantly trying to reduce those spiritual debts through various means that are available to you. It could be living a righteous life, it could be eating the correct food, but in any case, this whole mode of causal analysis in which you say, I'm not responsible, is not going to be available as a construal.
There are many problems with what I've said. One of them is a kind of a backward backtracking. In cognitive science, they've caught on to backtracking. For those of you who don't know it, years ago, people wanted to discover how come an animal eats something and 24 hours later gets sick from it and has learned not to eat that thing. And the argument is that we can move time, space in an interesting way, forwards and backwards. Our associative systems allow us to move backwards and forwards in time. So it is absolutely the case. If we could talk about religions as well. One of the
I want to step up a little bit because as a mathematician, I think very axiomatically, and I think we all are actually kind of agreeing. I want to go back to what you said. It's like there's a norm here, right? You shame someone with respect to a norm. I was shamed with respect to a body norm. What you're describing is when there is no other norm. Like those people did not have access to a community where it was okay to be fat, right? It wasn't fatness, that it was like this concept of a debt to the gods. That if they had, let me imagine if some of them had gone on a sort of a study abroad program.
It's nature, actually, not the gods.
Okay, the nature, whatever. My point is that like they were ensconced in this norm group. So of course they're not going to see a different way of thinking about it. And I just want to say, like, to another point you made, or maybe you made, that we're living in a shaming culture. So I'm just going to throw on another layer here. I also had another experience of shame when I worked in finance. I worked at a hedge fund during the crisis with Larry Summers, and I said, "Oh my God, we screwed up the world." I felt ashamed. I quit my job. I joined Occupy Wall Street, and I attempted to shame the government to improve financial regulation. And that was shame. I think shame is great. Shame is very, very useful.
You were punching up,
I was punching up.
Punching
right.
up.
So I like to think of shame in three categories: punching up, punching down, and I think shaming someone for their body, something that they can't control, is punching
But what
down.
about the usefulness for shame just for the person, independent of, because you're only talking about being shamed or shaming.
Yes.
But what just feeling of having shame or feeling shame?
I mean, shame, as you point out, it can be very useful for cohesion in a culture, right? I shame, for that matter, I shame my children when they don't do their chores, right? It's a lubrication to get people to follow the rules without having to explain the rules every single time and actually have to administer punishment when they don't. Let me just finish my framework and then I'll let you guys respond. I think there's a third type of shame that's getting more and more prevalent in this culture. There's punching up shame, there's punching down shame. The third type I call punching nowhere shame. And punching nowhere shame is when we sort of performatively shame people that will not care. And what I'm thinking here, emblematic example, is when people on the left, because I'm on the left, so when I go to Twitter, I'm seeing my lefty friends. They're retweeting Trump or Trump's son, and saying and sort of saying something to him in their retweet to sort of try to shame Trump. It's ludicrous. It's ludicrous. Like, do you think they are going to care what you're saying? But it's definitely an attempt to shame. It's a failed attempt to shame. It's a performative thing. And my question is, what is the end result of that? And my feeling is it's not just a waste of time, it's actually a problem. And I think the anti-vaxxing movement is largely a product of that. And I think the incels, which are the young, mostly white men who are misogynistic online, talking to each other about how terrible women are, and actually going out sometimes and killing people, killing women, is a very direct reaction to this shaming, performative shaming, punching nowhere culture.
People call this virtue signaling also, right?
That's what I mean by performance. I'm performing righteousness by shaming Don Jr.
Right.
Everyone retweet me.
Right.
But, it doesn't actually, and number one, it doesn't shame him. And number two, it just makes the other people more dehumanized. It dehumanizes them. It sort of focuses on us versus them.
Right.
Well,
But there's a sense in which, I think there's a certain picture of shame as oppressive, which comes from people who don't like living in closed communities where there are these norms that everyone shares, and they feel oppressed by it, and they want out. It's sort of the creative individual who is willing to be transgressive with regard to the norms, and they go to New York City, okay, rather than live in the small community. Now it seems to me what's happened, however, is that the surveillance that goes on in small communities, which produces shaming of all kinds, often to maintain social order, and often quite effectively, has now returned in the form of Twitter. It's now reformed in the terms of newspapers that are constantly looking to invade and get information that people think is private. And if they can expose it, it becomes now the equivalent on a much larger scale of these small communities. And ironically, that's what we're doing. The technologies have broken down the private-public distinction. The idea that you could find an area where you couldn't be shamed because you could draw the shade, you could close the door. It was in a private realm where you could be experimental with transgressive behavior and leave it there is no longer possible. And that reaches essentially, we found a way to have a technology that turns us into a small community again with all of these kinds of attempts you're describing to humiliate people.
We can do a taxonomy of shame, but anything can shame you if you have a standard, a rule, a goal, and you don't. These are cultural, determined, although there was some argument historically that shame or sham, German for back or backside, was in fact in the early attempts at trying to address it was around toilet training, and shame was there. Having lived a long life, when I was 6 or 7, I needed glasses, and it was shameful to wear glasses. You were called four eyes. Now we're not ashamed of wearing glasses. As you age, there's a hearing loss, okay? And I wear hearing aids. And hearing aids are designed, the technology, mostly that they should be hidden, because wearing hearing aids is shameful. So we can change readily what is or isn't shameful. The idea, to be helpful, is there has to be some cultural standard or rule. Now, interestingly enough, you could have a rule to be shameful. That is, it's good to be shameful. And so you could find many things. You might need to sweep away because you would step, or you can't eat a plant that's a root because there might be insects and destroy. So I don't know how useful it is. I think it is useful if we want to go contemporary to look at what's happening in not only our culture, but everywhere. To begin with, when I got a bad grade, as the son of parents born in Europe, turn of the century, but nonetheless, I was ashamed for their shame that I didn't get a good grade. I was not only ashamed for myself, I was ashamed that my parents' shame. Well, that doesn't seem much to be as much the case anymore. But it seems to me that we need to not talk about the different kinds. Let me just tell you what the observation in these meta-analyses are. One, amount of narcissistic behavior has enormously increased. Any scale or the various scales that supposedly measure it show an increase in this country. Two, an increase in perfectionism. That is, being overwhelmed by the concern for making an error. Three, decrease in empathy. All of these are, and an emphasis. I think these things come about, and Rick has hinted at it. These things come about because the self has become an increasing object to the self, so that selfies, tattoos, communication. It's a common knowledge, especially in the age group in this room, that you watch a couple sitting, each taking a picture of their dish, sending it to other people. These are very technologically advanced, very complex behavior. Hypothesis: the more you pay attention to yourself, the more trouble you ultimately get in. It's a pretty safe hypothesis. A baseball slump occurs because you start to think that you are in a slump, and thus the kind of physical timing that you need to hit a ball, swing at something before, as it's leaving the hand of the pitcher, gets disrupted. I have the problem when I have to shift.
Too self-conscious.
Yes, well, yeah.
I think the quote is, if you think, you stink.
That's right. So fundamentally,
In baseball.
on a steep hill, when I'm driving a shift, which I learned and drove most of my life, I was in Berkeley on Cedar Avenue, which has some steep hills that. And now you have to put it in neutral, and there's a car behind you, and you got to shift into first, and it's very steep, and if you start to think about, I may have trouble shifting, you're gonna have trouble shifting. The whole point in motor action is to get it out of the operating system, because there are better things in your head to be doing with. The point is, if in fact it is the case that we have become more self-involved as a way to be happy, I don't know what the goals are, that fundamentally you would get an increase in shame because you're paying attention to yourself, and therefore you would need mechanisms to get away from it, which is narcissism, a very powerful mechanism. It's not my fault, or I didn't make a mistake.
It's a defensive mechanism, in other words.
Well, they're essentially, yes, they're defensive mechanisms for the increase. So the decrease in empathy it's their fault. They're poor, it's their fault to be poor. A car hit them, they shouldn't have
Well,
been
the
doing it.
shamer in chief in the country right now. That's what he says all
So,
the time.
but Kathy, you are,
I'm sorry, I disagree.
You
I think
disagree.
Getting it wrong, like Darwin thought that like getting a red in the face was meant you're ashamed. That's too easy. It's not about selfies. Like selfies is narcissistic. Obviously, it's vain. Obviously, I think people who do that are more vulnerable. They're more vulnerable to shame. people who take selfies. Like, just define it that way. They are more vulnerable to shame, but I think the worst aspect of modern social media are not the selfies. They're just annoying. The worst aspect are the self-righteous shamers who are dehumanizing others and who are working actively to decrease our empathy. I think the empathy is the key. We are decreasing our empathy to people we don't agree with. We were like, if you think that, you must be a monster. And honestly, we say that about people with whom we agree 85% of the time, but we found the 15%. Social media helped us find it. The 15% where we disagree, and we're like, oh my God, I thought I liked you, but you're a monster. Now I know. That's the kind of performative self-righteous shaming that is a problem.
Isn't that a
Selfies is a
difference?
small thing.
It's an interesting difference between shame and guilt in this sense, because you do need the cooperation of the other person to feel guilty. If you try to, you might shame them and hope they feel guilty about something they've done. But to simply shame, you just need to leave a mark. It doesn't need to be reciprocated. I mean, you could, anyway.
Why do you think you need the cooperation of the other? I would have thought that guilt could be just between you and your ego ideal, and if you don't live
No,
up
I
to
mean,
it,
if you're-
you need the other to confess if that's the way in which you're going to unload your guilt. But
If you're posting online and you want to leave a shame mark on someone, you don't need them to reciprocate. That's why it goes on, and it goes on despite its futility.
What do you think the response is when you're the receiver of that? If you know that you've 85% agree with the person and they're accusing you of being a monster.
I personally feel terrible if that happens, but I'm afraid
You feel
these other
terrible,
people don't
but
feel
what else would you
terrible.
feel? You'd feel angry.
Yeah.
You'd feel outraged. And you would say, no, you're the monster. And that's the point. It becomes a feedback loop, a dynamical system where
I guess I was getting at the idea that it doesn't require as much empathy or back and forth for you to simply leave a mark that intends the shame versus to engage someone and make them feel remorseful.
It becomes infantile, right? It's like, I know you are, but what am I? That thing, right?
Yes.
It's at that level.
I'd like to pick up something Michael just said, because I do have this sense that there are certain prepotent areas that it's easier to shame than other areas, that it's just any arbitrary rule. And I'll get to this way. If you look at the explanations of illness around the world as an anthropologist, why people think they're suffering, there's a big three. The most frequent thing people do is point to interpersonal influences on themselves, like witchcraft, evil eye, sorcery, friends and neighbors who envy me, who are making me feel sick. And then there end up being moral explanations in which they blame themselves for their suffering, and they think they've transgressed in some way. And then there are, of course, biochemical explanations, which it turns out are not the most frequent on a worldwide scale. The other two are, and interpersonal are far and away the most common. But in the moral domain, when you look at what transgressions lead people to think, I did that and that's why I'm suffering right now, yes, there's a small number, and they end up being sexual, food, and authority relationships. So if you kick your father and 6 months later you go blind, you're not going to fail to wonder whether you're blind because you kicked your father. There's something about those areas of experience in life that somehow are prepotent. And I wouldn't be surprised shaming could work that way, too.
I think it's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis, indeed, that there may be prepotent, that is, failures or evaluations of one's behavior vis-a-vis some kind of standards, unique ones, may be prepotent, in fact. And there would be good reason to suggest that these should be very important and frequent enough events so that you protect against violating the rules, because it really is going to hurt you. One of the problems is now we're going to introduce embarrassment. Let me say a word about it. If I sat down with anyone in this room and said, tell me about things that embarrass you, you would, if you knew me for a while, you would tell me about embarrassing things. If I said, tell me about the things that shame you, you don't. And so it's been said that shame gets you into therapy. but prevents you from getting better.
Isn't embarrassment just a less intense form of shame?
Well, no, that there's two kinds of embarrassment. There's embarrassment of being the object of others' attention. Darwin talked about it, and it is certainly the case. I could show you, if, for example, the group around the table, decided we would all simply point at another person in unison. For no reason, we randomly selected it. That person being pointed to would get embarrassing. For example, when you're introduced and the introducer says very nice things about you, you certainly enjoy it, but you are certainly embarrassed. Now, you could argue you should be embarrassed, but I can show you in 18-month-olds to 24-month-olds, when this embarrassment comes in, children play a game of pointing to each other, and they tend to embarrass. The object of attention turns out to be a very early form of embarrassment. And it also starts to involve body, because the early forms is me here. So if you point to a child at 20 months who recognizes itself in a mirror by touching its nose, and you point to it, the child will show you embarrassment. If you ask children, how many of you have children, grandchildren, and the parent says, show grandfather or grandmother the new thing you do, and the child shows embarrassment.
Why isn't that just shame, a mild form of shame?
Well, because it seems by the reporter not to be shameful. People have trouble interpreting this because it also turns out to be an individual difference. Shy people are, in fact, those people who over-respond to being when very young, the object of others' attention. So there seems to be a distribution in the population of people who, when they're the object of attention, show embarrassment.
But isn't it fair to think that people have different thresholds for shame? Lower, higher?
Yes.
So they're wired that way. We're wired that way, right?
Yeah, and so there must be a usefulness to shame. Most of the conversation has been about shame as a problem, that you can shame. You gave the example of your school, they shamed you and you felt ashamed about your parents. But there must be some reason why we have this emotion of shame.
It's very important socially, for one thing.
Right.
You know,
But-
if you do something, let's say you're at a dinner party, and your host is going on. This won't happen tonight, but and you're irritated about something, maybe not even something to do with him, and you lose it. You lose your temper, right? And you
Insulting.
You insulted, exactly, and you're angry, right? Now, you know, I think a lot of us have done something like that, and you feel terrible, right? The feeling is you just feel like there's a sort of sickness, sinking, right? You just feel so ashamed of what you've done.
Because you have shamed him.
Well, I think you've acted in an entirely inappropriate way.
It draws attention to yourself.
We've all done this. I've done it. You know, you go away, you feel terrible. The next day you go over and you want to make it right. I think this is what Tompkins is talking about when he says that shame, inherent in shame, is a desire to restore the positive feeling, right? To restore what he calls the good seed. And you apologize. And you say, I behaved so inappropriately. I'm very sorry,
So look at the way.
And so that's highly functional because it's a highly
Well, it would be
social-
more functional if it prevented you from doing what you did.
Well, it often does, right? I mean, it often prevents you from it. Let's say the person is and they correct themselves before they do it, right? They control themselves.
Is a very important mechanism to reduce shame. Confession. You say, just as you indicated, I am sorry I did that. Forgive me. So clearly there are mechanisms to reduce it. One of them is displacement, to blame the other and become angry. Another is to internalize it and move toward depression. I am a worthless creature now and in the future. And,
Or to deny you ever did
and
it.
the other one is to make fun of yourself, interestingly enough, especially in
But
embarrassment.
Michael,
What would you make of socialization techniques designed in some subcultures to induce it? So, for example, Heidi Fang has done observations of children in families in Taiwan. And the mother, when she's around other associates or relatives or friends, will bring in her young child who has transgressed in some way, like you was describing, and has them narrate their transgression. Tell them how bad you were. And it's not a confession. It's not really there to get rid of some feeling. It's there to recapitulate it and to have this child essentially cultivate a sense of shame by inducing it in a very public way. Presumably, that's going to be relatively effective in having it not happen.
Can I just jump in about that?
And when she shows the videotapes at an American Psychological Association meeting, everyone views it as child abuse, and she has to stop showing it because it provokes such a discussion.
So public shaming was a thing
Right.
in this country. There was a book called So You've Been Publicly Shamed, written by John Ronson recently, or maybe Ron Johnson, I can't remember how he says his name. And he did a study about this, a sort of New England, early America, sort of Scarlet Letter type stuff. And he researched sort of the history of it, and it stopped eventually, not because it became less useful, but because it was so harsh. Like the public view, the people who came to see the public shaming were so into it that it was embarrassing to the authorities. That's why they stopped doing it, not because it didn't work.
So I have a mini example of this. I lived with a 6-year-old daughter and 10-year-old son in rural India for a year, and they went to a local convent school. And one day, my son said to my wife, I don't want to go to school today. And she explored it. Why didn't you want to go to school today? Because he had seen when you didn't do well on a math exam in that school, they pinned it to your back and you wore it all day long around the school. That was their technique for public shaming, which, it's a complicated thing. We can view that as harsh. He obviously we come from a subculture where we weren't going to let that happen. Nevertheless, internally, I'll bet those kids are all over the world doing really good math now.
Susan Miller has several books that are 25 years old that documents very clearly spare the rod, spoil the child. Fundamentally, the theme to teach moral behavior. You teach. You will forgive me, that you were born in sin. Okay? And that, so we have in Christianity the belief you are born in sin.
Hinduism has that too. It's a different form, but you come into the world with a long history of transgressions in prior lives. So you're not an innocent blank slate.
There are techniques which, for the most part, we've given up as publicly acceptable, but in fact are employed. How many parents, if you watch them with their children and the child does something, switches up their nose, for those of you who can see my face, which is a semi-disgust face, and says, that's disgusting. You're disgusting. Disgust is a very, very powerful shame elicitor.
So we were talking about, and I wanted to hear you tie together what you believe is the connection between embarrassment and shame. Before you do, I just want to add this extra ingredient, which is these do all have biological rudiments, like disgust expression, the early stages of which embarrassment can be elicited in children, et cetera, suggest to me that these potential, I would say, components of shame start even on a very biological basis before they're co-opted by society and
John
form
Gottman,
shame.
who studied divorce in couples in trouble, has pointed out that when one member of the couple exhibits a shame face toward the other for some action or some statement, the consequence of that is either the one receiving the disgust face shows a depressive reaction, or in fact gets angry back. How dare you shame me?
Yeah.
So clearly, we're going to have to worry about shame publicly, but also shame privately.
But there's a
Shame,
difference between saying,
embarrassment is a
saying to a
public.
child, that's disgusting, and that's, that's shameful, or shaming the child. I think there's a significant difference between the two.
Well, okay.
No, don't you think?
You'll
I mean,
find some
we have-
definitions
we
of
have-
shame which say it's a fear of being perceived as disgusting. That's actually.
Well, that would be.
Well, it depends on,
It's
I would say,
broken.
if you
It's
say,
certainly-
don't eat that, that's
right.
disgusting, that's different from you're disgusting.
Yeah.
Because you ate that.
For eating
Yes.
that, yeah.
It's a question of whether
If you
you
say
are.
you should be ashamed of yourself, it doesn't seem to me to be as toxic as saying that you're disgusting. You're a disgusting person. Because a disgusting person, that's very rejecting,
Yes.
right? That's very distancing. It's where in shame, there's always a bridge back.
But how it's heard may depend on the child, too, to a degree.
Look, forgiveness.
I would like to add something a bit
forgiveness
different.
isn't always a-
I would like to add something a bit different, because it is, from everything you are saying, the implication is that you become frequently ashamed because you have been shamed often growing up. That's not necessarily, I don't think it's the experience of psychoanalysts in general. It's certainly not my experience. Some people have more shame, some people have less shame, and it's not based on to what degree their parents or their teachers or the school shamed them.
Well,
It
part of
seems
the
to do,
problem
and the
is
psychoanalytic
being
idea that it has a
shamed,
lot
you
more
become
to do.
victimized.
Sorry?
And you become victimized if you are repeatedly shamed. And becoming victimized means you become the victim. And so the report was that I really was shameful, not that my parent necessarily did that to me. Indeed, what one would like to see, if we could do such an experiment, is to see in a high-shaming family, what does the child do when the child finally becomes in charge and the parents are now old. We don't talk about old people being abused, but a sweet revenge to a lifetime of being shamed. So.
I wanted to get back to Kathy's observation about the historical change that took place, let's say from the Massachusetts Bay Colony or 17th century Puritanism and its morality. Because I do think in some sense the cyber stocks are back right now, and we're very much like that period once again, given the technologies that we have. But I do feel that it's important to think about societies that liberate individuals from communal ethics of community type structures. And when that happens, I think they begin to see those techniques as harsh, even though they were effective. But here's a triad that, think about the following three emotions: happiness, shame, and anger. And if I ask you, which is most different from the other two? Happiness, shame, anger. Which is the odd one out? If I do that in a University of Chicago class, the responses are either going to be happiness is the odd one out, is most different, or some people will say shame is the odd one out. And it's largely based on a hedonic view of the emotions. Does it feel good or doesn't it? Feels good. They think it, or you're full. It feels good to be happy. Okay, it doesn't feel good to be shamed or
But
to
as
be
you know,
angry.
there are
Well,
many
let me
more
finish.
negative
Let me finish.
terms.
And some people say shame because they think that means the ego has been diminished Whereas if you're happy and anger, you're full of yourself. If I do this in the Indian community I work in, the overwhelming response is anger is the most different from the other two, which is a very rare response in our subculture. And for them, shame and happiness are the glue of social relationships, and anger is destructive of social relationships. And that's a totally different way of viewing it. And I think it has correlates in the way in which their societies is organized, on the degree to which individualism versus some form of collectivism is a part of the organization of social life. And that puts boundaries on a lot of the generalizations we make about whether something's useful or not, what our own evaluative reactions are to it, and so forth.
Let's come back to, let's broaden it if we can, to bring in the other kinds of self-conscious emotions which you were starting to do, such as, I have claimed that there are two kinds of embarrassment. One is a very basic, early, does not require elaborate cognition. The child shows it. Soon after, it starts using personal pronouns like me and mine. And that is an individual difference in their reaction to being the object of attention. That's easy to do in a laboratory setting. You bring a kid in and you and you start complimenting the child on how pretty they look or how handsome they look or whatever. You ask the child to do things like dance to banging a tambourine. And what you see in the children being the object of attention, they show embarrassment. About a year and a half later, when you now start to incorporate the standards, the rules, the goals of your family and the society at large, you now have another embarrassment, which is embarrassment against some kinds of standard. That starts to move us toward shame. But I put to you that, at least in this culture where we have two words, if I ask you to tell me something that embarrasses you, you would have more readily willing to do it than if I asked you about something that shamed you. And
isn't that, again, just intensity? We also have the word humiliation, which is a very intense form of shame, right? Or mortification, which, as I think you mentioned earlier, you're dying of shame. I mean, I think people experience embarrassment of some kind or another every day in a mild form, right?
Sure, but there are certain things that really define you, okay? So if someone says, Michael, your parallel parking is really atrocious, I may not like it. I may feel, yeah, you're right, going backwards has become more difficult as I've aged. Fine.
Except on the steep
But if they said, gee, your last book is absolutely horrible, it would elicit more anger, obviously, than the going backwards.
Exactly.
But it would certainly elicit more embarrassment, shame, with a bad review. So clearly, there are different aspects of ourselves which are more important.
I'm going to, if you guys don't mind, layer on one more layer to this conversation, which I'm fascinated thinking about, because we've talked a lot about the individual experience of shame. You've talked a little bit about norms within a culture and how that changes it. I want to talk about group shame. Group shame, and I'll just throw out an example, the Catholic Church. Remember I talked about the phases of shame. There's sitting in the shame, there's outrage and denial of the shame, then there's facing the facts, and then there's stepping outside and saying, this is what happens. I'm just going to throw that out. The Pope came out and he started talking about, sexual abuse of children is a terrible thing. It's really terrible. Isn't it terrible? He didn't actually say, this is what happened in the church. This is what we're going to do about it. He never really cleaned house. He never really went through stage 3. He kind of jumped to stage 4, like, you can all forgive me. This is an apology, quote unquote. Of course, I'm putting my take on it. But my point is that I want to talk about how groups inhabit shame, how they get outraged by accusations, how they come to see the truth, face their own facts, clean their own house. How do they navigate shame as groups?
Well, did they navigate shame? Was only when we told them you should have felt shame about this, then they thought, oh yes, we did something shameful
Well, let's
and
put it this way,
possibly
the group-
didn't.
See, I mean, individual. Let me give you another example. There's a very widespread habit in this country of shaming children when they don't have enough school lunch money. And what will happen is that the children will either not be fed, they will just be not fed at school, or their lunch will be thrown away in front of them, and they sometimes even get branded on their arm. I don't have enough lunch money. The individuals who work at the lunchrooms sometimes refuse to do this policy, and they get fired. So I'm not claiming that, I think of that as a sort of systemic shame, if you will. Mm-hmm. It is created as a policy, and it is perpetrated by groups. Not every single individual in the group has to agree with it as a policy, because they might actually find it too shaming. And for that matter, I mean, obviously lots of priests were doing terrible things, but not every priest thought that was a good idea. Like, we can't assume that it was like a unified attempt, right? But at the same time, it is a group thing. It's sort of a group navigation led by the Pope, perhaps. But like, what is happening there? And when are we going to actually see them get to stage 3, cleaning house, tell us what the consequences are, cleaning up their act?
Isn't it the same process as for an individual?
That's what
I think it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing about it, that is, it's good news and bad news. It's good news because we kind of understand it. It's bad news because, well, I feel like I'm in stage 4 with gay bashing or fat shaming or race shaming, but I can't be in charge of everyone. Like, how do we get the rest of, how do we pull people in this direction?
Stages imply you're moving toward something.
Yeah.
What are you moving toward?
An understanding.
Understanding of what?
Well, see, the examples I just gave are all in the first category.
No, you were talking about stages.
Yeah.
Tell me about stages, because I don't know what that means.
Right.
Stages reflect a sequence,
Yes,
where either a combination of biology and culture, or culture or biology. So, are you talking about a level of no shame? I don't think so. But maybe you are. What should
progress amount to? And
what is
that's
progress?
what you're right.
I have a whole chapter in the Shame book on this problem of progress. What is progress? What is progress? So, what is the ideal? Let me put it this way. Tell me, from your perspective, what the ideal society would be. Would there be shame in it?
There would not be punching down shame. So I was going to say that the examples I gave, sexual abuse, shaming people for being poor, shaming children for not having school lunch money, gay bashing, those examples are examples of punching down shame, which I claim exist quite a lot. There's a lot of power being maintained around punching down shame. There's a lot of profit being made from punching down shame. And it is, I would call it invalid shame. And the idea of progress would be to get past it. And that would require that people who are shamed by it say, no, it's not acceptable.
When would it be okay to be shamed? When you did those things.
Well,
if you did those things that people are doing, this punch down.
I characterize punching down shame as when you are shaming someone either who has no choice, who has either no choice or no voice. So they either have no choice to conform to the norm, or they have no power to explain themselves.
So how's the lunch money thing work? I don't quite have a picture of that as a shaming device.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah.
You've never heard of that?
No.
It happens in more than half the school districts in this country.
Really?
Yeah, no, but why is it shaming? What form does it take? What's said?
You are refused, you do not given food. Okay, that's the number one. You're not given food. You're deprived of food. You're basically labeled as unworthy of food.
That's incredible.
It is the most basic form of shaming. And they are branded, and it's public. It is like, hey, your parents didn't pay for food. You're not going to get food. Everybody knows it in the school lunch.
Even if they can't afford to give the money.
Of course, it's their children. I mean, just to be clear, this is children. It's their parents that are supposed to pay. So they have no power.
Yes, right, yes, exactly.
I would love to know a source for half the school systems in the
Okay, I'll give it to you. Yeah.
Great. I would really
Wow.
like. That's hard to believe.
It is
But
hard to believe. It's outrageous, actually.
Optimist.
The terrible behavior that people are capable of perpetuating is not surprising. So whether we want to call it up or down punching, which is fine, it's a way of a taxonomy. You're applying there's a good shame or a bad shame. If my child comes back with a paper or something they've done and they've not done well, what are you going to tell parents or the tiger moms, as they're called? You shouldn't be doing that. I mean, how can we disagree with people doing these things to children? I mean, this can't be any
There are
argument.
laws against child abuse, so I think we can disagree about
But
certain things.
tell me specifically about shame.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you were fat shamed.
Yeah.
Does that mean that you are more prone to shame as a result of that? Or does that mean that you are no more prone to shame than anybody else? In other words, is the implication that that kind of shaming leaves rather serious marks on the person that is indelible? Or is it that some people react one way, kids react one way, some kids react the other way, and some grow up without much shaming by anybody and they have more proneness to shame, and some don't?
That's a good question. I mean, my parents shamed me, I think, because they were fat. So they were sort of propagating a certain type of shame onto me. I have not done that to my children, but that's because I've thought a lot about it. Like I went through these stages I'm trying to describe. That's one of the reasons I came up with this taxonomy of shame, is to understand when is it unfair, when is it possible
But are
to
you
pass through
yourself
it.
more prone to shame than, let's say, your
I
husband
think I'm
or your
more aware
kids?
of my shame.
More aware, but
think I'm
not
more
more
aware.
prone. In other words, you don't more easily than
What do
somebody
you think
else.
the connection? I would like to hear what, instead of, I'm going to
I don't
bounce
know.
it back to you.
No, I'm only asking because it seems to me, from my perspective and my experience, the kind of outside shaming is not what often or necessarily leads to a proneness to shame later, but rather certain developments in the strength of the person's self, in their self-esteem, in their view of themselves, is what contributes to how they feel later.
Interesting.
Let me support that. It's in another life. I work in pediatrics, and we've been doing a study, the fellows. We have a fellowship program, and I'm in charge of the research. And there is a fellow who is studying the siblings of children who have ASD, who are autistic on the spectrum. And the idea being, what does a sibling feel about having a sibling who is demonstrably different? And the interesting finding so far is that there are a good number of the people who end up taking care of handicapped kids or kids with disabilities are in fact from families from which they had a close member, as well as just the opposite. So that indeed, supporting what you're saying, that in fact an experience can have very different consequences. One is a social good. There are people committed to working with these children who, until now, we don't have much resource to improve, but they were working with them, versus those who probably develop, I did it, and if you don't do it, you're You
Do you
know.
view this as temperamental difference, or do you view it as?
People are born with different, some people are more resilient. I think they're born that way, right?
Yeah.
Other people
I
are more
actually
fragile.
think- But you know, after spending 40 years at a medical school, my thoughts about the biology of our bodies are that, you know, we're not all the same. Temperament, however we may conceive of it, there are different things. I had my son and daughter are 50-year-olds, but when they were babies, and I would, you know, toss them. I mean, I never threw them in the air, but, you know, just the girl baby, the younger, she loved it, and she loves the rough and tumble. She goes in shark cages and in cages protecting you from shark. My son, who was in terror of it, in fact.
This temperamental issue is interesting, but I want to try and get my mind around your question about groups and how do they react. And I guess I need some clarification, because when you say how does a group deal with its own shame,
Yes.
do you mean they have in fact done something which everyone would agree is shameful, or do you mean they have been shamed by some powerful group telling them that what they're doing is shameful? So, for example, we have many examples in colonial domination situations. Let's say you believe the West is best, and its view of gender relations, its view of XYZ is closer to the truth than those primitives or backward peoples of the world. And you start dominating those groups and telling them that what they're doing with regard to gender relations, how they raise their children, all this is shameful. Now, is that the kind of question we're dealing with? How do those groups then react? Because we know that some groups identify with the colonials and quickly become colonialized. We know other groups have rebellions against it and have all sorts of resistance. We have revival movements that go on. But these are power dynamics that are very different from the way you framed it. You framed it with examples in which you're inviting us all to agree that's shameful what they did, not that some group is shaming another group from its power position. And those are very different situations. And I'm just wondering what you...
And after
have in
you
mind.
answer, we will go to questions.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I'm not sure I was scrupulously careful about the examples, but what I really want to focus on is changing norms. Probably is the best way of saying it. And maybe a good example in that context is the Me Too movement. So the Me Too movement is a movement because we are changing our norms. We never actually thought it was okay to assault women. We never thought that. But the norm was that the women kept quiet. The norm has changed. And now there's a lot of group shame among the men who now feel like, oh, what I used to be doing was inappropriate. That's an example of group shame. And I'm not saying they're all actually feeling like I should feel ashamed. Some of them are outraged that these norms changed under their feet, and how dare that norm change? I was perfectly comfortable, and now I'm a bad guy. So that is, but it's a group shaming, and my theory is that it goes through the stages of shame, similar to the way I laid them out. And I might be wrong about that. I don't mind being wrong. Because I'm a mathematician, I'm trained to just be happy to be wrong.
Without shame.
If you can explain, yeah, it's actually one of those freeing things as a mathematician is that you say something and someone says you're wrong, and you're like, thanks for not, like, I won't waste my time on it. But like, it's useful even if it's wrong, I believe, to understand group shame as an evolution through stages similar to the individual.
Okay, we'll go for questions. So there is the mic, and
The
go
mic
to
that
it.
works now?
I hope it works now.
It was very interesting here today, listening to everybody. Some of the things that we did not talk about today, what about people like everybody knows Martha Stewart, who was incarcerated for a period of time. She was shamed, and then she was released from jail, and Martha Stewart just picked up right from where she left off, and she's on TV, and she's selling her merchandise. And just recently, we have Anthony Weiner, who was in some sort of a halfway house for pornography and all that. Now Anthony Weiner was released, and he's thinking about going into politics again. So I'm just using a couple of extreme examples that we did not talk about today.
Thank you. Who wants to respond?
Sounds like you're proposing banishment.
I mean, part of the problem is that shame is, I think it fits with the change in empathy. And by the way, rules, manners, we haven't gotten to, which would be a very important part of the discussion. The idea of letting it all hang out, as opposed to rules governing our behavior. So you write a thank you note for dinner, whether you liked it or not. Now that it would be called lying. So the whole issue and the change in social, protecting the feelings of others have given way to be authentic. And indeed, the election really hinged on the fact that even though he was a terrible man, he was at least authentic, where she was inauthentic. And so is, so the fact is that we're allowed, we have no shame about being shamed, is in fact what's occurring.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to comment on individual versus institutional shame. You brought up the example of the Catholic Church and why hasn't the Pope felt more shame. Institutions make political and financial decisions. They can't be shamed the way individuals are. But my question is to the I see some agreement here. My question is to the professional psychologists among you, and this concerns the most prominent shamer, the shamer in chief. Do you feel that this is more strategic and purposeful than he's given credit for? Or on the other end of the spectrum, does he suffer from a pathology?
Look, 40% of the people believe that he has done nothing wrong. That is to say, we're back to facts. Even though you can demonstrate that he says he hasn't said something, and you have a tape of him saying it, he would just call it fake news. So one of the things that narcissists can do is that they change the rules, the normative behavior. So while you're having now men who did things that they shouldn't have done and now feel a movement to get them to feel, there is also this movement of there's nothing to be ashamed about.
Well,
you can make norms, you can go any way you want with them.
You know, under or behind, masked by his behaviors, which are defensive mechanisms, is toxic shame.
Yes.
Right? If you read anything about his upbringing, his background, he has massive shame, humiliation. And these are all, as narcissism almost always is,
I have a paper that says
a defensive
Trump
mechanism.
is lying a bad
He
name.
avoids, he attacks, right? Those are his two.
Well, this ties in nicely with what...
Shame is so intolerable to him.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He changes norms.
No.
He changes facts. He changes norms.
But you mentioned
and he
earlier,
blames others.
both of you talked about the idea of...
I don't think he's aware that he has, I don't think he'd ever admit or is aware that that's why he's doing it.
So then it's a pathology.
It's a pathology, absolutely.
More than a strategy.
Yes, exactly. It's a pathology.
You both talked about anger as being a reaction to be accused, to be shamed by others, to respond with anger. And I think you very wisely, Kathy especially, mentioned that in this purposeless shaming, I think one of the reactions of the parties that are shamed is they get angry, and unfortunately they get mobilized. This is what this shamer in chief relies on, that if you try to shame me and I don't want to accept it, I'm going to get angry with you. How dare you try to shame me? And that mobilizes a lot of the populace, I think.
Okay,
unfortunately.
next question.
So I just want to get back to, it's not my fault, first of all. My question, but to you would be to please elaborate on why you stated that men usually say it's not my fault more than women. But before you answer that, in terms of it's not my fault, I've always been under the impression that a person that cannot take criticism or it's not my fault, they say that because they've been criticized quite a lot, either by their parents or... So I don't know if that has anything to do with it's not my fault, that defensive mechanism, but that goes into not being able to even take criticism. I didn't do it, it's not my fault, and it's very pathological if you... So the question, though, really is why men more than women?
Okay. Understand why that's important. If you win the lottery, you don't feel proud. You feel very happy because it's a chance you didn't cause it. Although some people will say, I went to a particular store and I knew that that was. So they give themselves causality and they can feel pride because it's negotiable here. So winning the lottery, an event, you don't, most people do not feel proud of winning a lottery because it's chance. It has nothing to do with you causing it. So believing that you cause it or not cause it is a very good mechanism to move you around these self-conscious emotions. If it's not my fault, then I can feel anything I want that's appropriate. And so you can manipulate it. It's not my fault, so I'll do some manipulation. Now, the sex difference. There are many explanations. There are data in which you can look at when parents are teaching children in the laboratory tasks to do, and the child doesn't succeed. What does the parent say? And it turns out that parents make these performance or global attributions more to girls than they do to boys. That is to say, when the child is supposed to be able to do a puzzle and the child can't do it, and you ask, you listen to what the child says, a parent could say at the extremes, oh, you're so stupid. Why don't you get that? Parents say these things. Or they could say, it's a very hard problem. Why don't you try again and give them a strategy? And it turns out that giving strategies, rather than making global attributions, are more likely for mothers now to give this to the boy child than to give it to the girl child. Why? I don't know why it is, but I can only tell you what we think may be going on. But let me give you another, and I really think it's another reason. I think girls are much more, that is the womankind, are much more concerned about their bodies than men. That, I don't know how broad it is. I can say that in most cultures that I've been to, if it's a more formal occasion, the women are better dressed than the men. The only place that might not be true is Italy. In India, it's certainly
Look at the Maasai.
yeah, okay.
The men
It's
are-
not always
Right,
true.
right.
It is not always true, but indeed, the attending to the body is a necessity given that menstruation, which an adolescent starts with, you have to be concerned with your body. Men don't have that concern. In the research of pre-adolescence, you ask boys, what do you feel about the fleshiness under your arm or the thickness of your thighs. And the 9-year-old boys, they don't have anything to say about it. They never thought about it. And 9-year-old girls are already telling you, oh, I think this is too much. And so there is a concern for the body. So the question is, why is that? One solution, women have said it, they're objects, sexual objects for men, and so they become objectified. And that's a reasonable hypothesis. But an alternative one.
But where's that "it's not my fault" link? How's that linked to that?
Okay, if you attend more to yourself, and that's where temperament would come in. If there's more information that you are deriving out of your body sense, that information is more likely to make you think about yourself, and therefore more likely to move toward the attributions. If something went wrong, I caused it.
I have a
But
slightly...
to comment just on your question,
I would like to add to this a little bit. Martha Stewart, was that your example?
No.
Whose example is that? Yeah, Martha Stewart, she never would have been prosecuted if she were a man doing exactly what she did. Like, it's the expectations of society that villainized her in the first place. Good for her for going back to work. That's what I say. I would also like to keep an eye on the Trump officials that get blamed for their terrible behavior as Trump officials, like Kirstjen Nielsen and Sarah Sanders. What about all the guys? Like, we accuse women we shame women much more often and much more than we shame men. And I say that as a person who's written journalistic essays for Bloomberg. I get unbelievable hate from the commenters as a woman, just unbelievable. It is completely documented. So I'm just saying it is socialized to a large extent. And of course, one last thing, dieting. Guess who diets? Girls. Guess why? They're told to diet. It's by their parents. So it's very, very good data that this is socialized.
The Justice Department doesn't like it when people lie to public officials. And Martha Stewart was not sent to jail because of the insider trading accusation. Insider trading itself is a very complicated area, and it's gone through lots of changes. But when you lie, when you're being interrogated by the FBI, they don't look at your gender. That's like a fundamental principle for them, whether you like it or not. I don't like it. I agree with you about Martha Stewart. Good for you. And I think it was unfair to just nail her on the procedural thing. But they do that all the time, and they do it to men and women. I have a somewhat different view than Mike. I would be really skeptical of a generalization about gender in this area, because I think a really fundamental principle of action is the premise that all human beings have, is that there's a relationship between action and outcome. You know, I caused it. I swing an axe. Something happens. Everyday life is built on the fundamental premise of a relationship between action and outcome. And that's the default. That's where you start. If you're going to move away from it, there are special cases in which you might have a conception of something, the world being simply a lottery. It's a horrible notion if you really think about it that way, because you're losing control of your life if it's that way. And the relationship of action and outcome has all sorts of manifestations for men and women. And I would bet you can find areas where men might be one way and women another, and just the opposite in some other domain. But I'd really be surprised if the most fundamental premise was what you do has consequences and you're responsible for it.
In my limited experience, because it's only from within my office, it's not based on extensive research, but in my experience, I do not see a distinction. But what I do see is that the harder the person is on themselves, the more they're tempted to say it's not my fault when they're confronted with something. The more the person is willing to accept that they have done something wrong, the less they're willing, they need to say, oh no, it's not my fault.
The question is, why is somebody harder on himself?
That's a complicated question because it involves all sorts of developmental issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm I'm overcoming my public speaking shame by doing this. That's what I tell them. Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you. My question is, I always thought of guilt as being really almost like the introjected parental figure telling us what to do, and shame more as being part of the death drive, as aggression towards ourselves. So I think that, in my own opinion, to get over shame, we can sublimate that aggression outwards into more socially acceptable and positive ways. What are your views on that?
I would recommend that everyone go back and see the movie Four Feathers done by Korda. And the movie Four Feathers, done in the 1930s, in which you were in a military family in England and they're going off to the Sudan to fight. And one of the buddies decides he's not going to go, and the four feathers are the feathers that you receive being accused of being a coward, in this case by his fiancée and his buddies. And the rest of the movie is about his attempt to do incredible things of courage to be accepted back into this, having been shamed so powerfully. And that seems to me as a kind of typification of how shame works in a society that has statuses, has clear goals, has notions of the good, and when you fall out of it and you are called on it, it's an incredibly powerful set of motivations that go on. And the movie is well worth seeing if you want to see, let's call it the pre-modern view of how this whole thing operates. And it doesn't fit that definition for me.
A friend of mine last night told me, which has some truth in it, that guilt is an afterthought. Guilt is an afterthought. Is that you commit the act and then you say, oh, I feel terrible about it.
Right.
It rarely stops you from committing the act. It seems to me shame is one of the emotions we have. We have love, we have shame, we have all those things. So I don't think it has anything to do with death drive or anything. It's just an emotion that humans have, and I guess some animals have it.
I tend to think of guilt and regret as having some spatial connection, because the focus is on how to correct the wrong, whereas in shame, the self is attacked, thus very powerful. So I think that definition, that distinction, is probably one from a behavioral point of view and also from a general theoretical point of view. That kind of distinction is worth having.
But isn't guilt simply moral shame, immorality shame, plus fear? Because guilt involves fear of punishment, too. Where,
well,
you know...
I guess so. I mean, those are a lot of words. I'm not quite sure what they mean. I think, in fact, that...
It means that you've made moral transgression.
There is a vast literature, of which I'm not much of a part of, which, in fact, looks at whether it's around achievement, but it's very relevant, is you can look at your performance, or you can look at the task. And for example, Carol Dweck has made a very big, a whole career based on this distinction. I can focus and say, gee, I'll give you a perfect example. You write a paper, and you send the paper into a journal. These are the kind of activities I do. And back comes the paper, and it's rejected, and there's a whole set of criticisms. I can do one of two things, depending on what it elicits in me, this failure. I can look at what they criticized and focus upon that. This will cause me a set of actions to try to repair or save the paper. If in fact the result is a damaged self, I put it in a drawer and I forget about it. And when you work with graduate students and fellows in medicine, one of the things to try to teach them, and it is teachable, that's interesting from a therapeutic point of view, is in fact, I don't want to hear about you, what a lousy scientist you are. I want you to go home and I want you to list each criticism separately and write some response. Do I have to do another analysis? Do I need to read more? Focusing them on the task gets them to stay in the game and try to correct the failure. If in turn you think you're a lousy scientist, you will want to forget it. One way of coping with that shame is to forget it, and so you put it in a drawer. And exactly what you said, and in fact, you want a mechanism that stops you in your tracks. It is sufficient that you can't do this except to great cost to your self-esteem, if you like. Whereas in guilt, you fundamentally want to repair it. And you can actually see it in behavior. You can see these children.
But you want to repair it in shame, too. The
No,
example I
you don't.
gave of doing
No,
something
no.
inappropriate.
You have a
Focus is
question?
on-
If you do something in a social context, it's inappropriate.
No,
And
you don't repair
you
it.
shame yourself,
In fact, one of the
and
problems
you want to
of
repair
shame-
it. You want to go and say, I'm so sorry, I behaved so, I don't know
It
what came
is a
over me.
repair.
That's
So is forgetting
that's
it.
also reparative.
So
Okay, let's go to the next question.
I'm also facing my public shame here. But my question is something that hasn't been discussed here. So I read in this book that shame is one of the pillars of loneliness. So what do you guys think about that? I just want
pillar
to
of what?
understand
I'm
from
sorry.
your
Loneliness.
Loneliness.
You know, I'm going to jump in and tell you how I understand shame, and this is through a lot of reading. It's not my definition, and I'm trying to remember the person's name whose book it's from, but it's this idea of a disintegration of self, that you basically have this connection with your caretaker when you're a child, and it's a good feeling. And then at some point they are disappointed in you, they shame you, and it feels like you do not have a self. And you're so desperate to get back into that connection that you would literally do anything. And if you can't get back into that connection, you feel completely floating. You feel disintegrated, like you do not have a connection to your mother or whatever. And that, I mean, of course, that elicits loneliness. So I think there's a very strong connection with that definition of shame, which maybe isn't the only one, but that definition of shame is loneliness. It is, in fact, the definition of being alone, when you're disconnected from everything else.
Some feelings are shameful. And so you can be ashamed of being guilty, but you can't be guilty about being ashamed. And you can be ashamed about being lonely. Now the question is, if you feel lonely, can you be ashamed?
Thank you.
So clearly, if you believe that you should be a part of the social group, there are people who, interestingly, who don't have a lot of social interaction, much prefer to be on their computer than to go to a party. So that loneliness may not be shameful because they don't have a value that they should be socially integrated.
Okay.
And Asperger is a perfect indication because part of the Asperger personality is, in fact, they're interested in things more than people.
Okay, last question.
Hi, I am wondering about the relationship between shame and the stability of a society, because it seems to me that in very, very stable societies, whether it's a family or a larger society like our nation, shame is sometimes weaponized when the society changes, and perhaps it's a function of fear of the change. And shame is used whether to put down a racial group
or women, or to impose certain standards. These things really ramp up when the society is changing, really to maintain the stability of the society. So it's almost a political weapon.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to echo you that I think we can look at our society and see that norms are changing very, very quickly. And I would even argue that people think they're changing faster than they actually are changing, because we have this artificial sense of accomplishment on social media when it looks like in our tiny little corner of Facebook that we all agree that such and such is true, when in fact it's a very small corner of Facebook. I think we actually are being misled by our intuitions around social norms, and we think things are changing faster. But that goes to your point, which is that if some people think the norm is now you have to ask 3 times before having sex with someone, and and other people think, no, you don't even have to ask, it's not surprising that conflict emerges. And when conflict about what we thought we already knew about norms, that is ripe for shame. That is what shame is for, right? Shame is for coercing people into the norm. So if they got it wrong, actually 95% of people are getting it wrong. What the fuck is wrong with these people? It's because we actually think we've accomplished more norm changing than we have. And that's what's happening right now. And we have, I think you made the point, one of the norms that we're seeing change is the idea of being authentic rather than factual, right? Or honest. That is itself a norm that is ripe for shaming, because it's exactly the point. The point of that norm is that people who follow that norm, who are in that norm group, are exactly the people that are going to be shamed by people who are like, no, we haven't agreed to that change in the norms, right? You are actually supposed to be an honest person, not a shameless person. So there's so much going on right now. It's chaos, honestly, with respect to changing norms. When there's chaos with changing norms, there is an uptick, if not an explosion, of shame.
This is off the top of my head, but I think it makes sense to think about the balance between the private and the public in societies. And when you're thinking about social change, there needs to be some kind of balance between those two. The domain of the private is a way in which you can't be shamed, because what you're doing with people who you're close to or are intimate with, or trust you, is not something you would necessarily do with anybody. And now what's happened is the anybodies of the world are in that private domain, exposing it. And now your reputation, your career is affected because of something you happened to say in private that someone was able to eavesdrop on or leak. So basically our leaks, and this is with the irony of our free press, because our free press are a bunch of snoops. They're trying to dig into the private realm all the time. They're encouraging people to leak information, which would normally be in an insular area where you couldn't be shamed, and they're shaming all sorts of people. And I think the Me Too movement, in fact, has brought us back to the 17th century cyber stocks. That's why I use that notion. We have the stocks going all the time now. I don't think it's healthy for our society. And to the extent we continue to erode the private domain, it's an area where creativity can go on, transgressive experimentation can take place in miniature. Some of that stuff is truly loathsome. Others ends up being creative stuff that then filters out more broadly into the society.
I think you guys are correct. And I think there's a commonality in that idea. But I think there's another thing. There's the idea of happiness. We haven't gotten to happiness. It was interesting that you brought it up as one of the best. I have to tell you the story. So I think I mentioned my father was born in the 19th century. So, in the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. And he believed that if you did something well, you would be happy. And we now believe if you are happy, you will do something well. Our focus has moved, which is part of the self-focus, on our happiness. So in another roundtable, the discussion of happiness And there's some wonderful books of how searching for happiness has made us miserable, is really the theme. So not only are some of the changes in technology which support some of this. Namely, I walk down, I live in the village. I walk down the streets and I'm a little old man and a big towering person is walking toward me, reading their phone, and I have to say, excuse me, or he's going to run me down. If we said, oh, well, we used to have people walk down the street reading books, that was not the case. People didn't walk down the street reading books. But what?
Making a joke.
Yeah. So I think there is a shift to this happiness, to this idea that the self deserves certain things, and I think it's in part why there's a decline in empathy and indeed a rise in narcissism. So.
We have done, by the way, a roundtable on happiness, but thank you very much.
Will we be happy to do it again?
Okay, you promise me you won't be careful. You promised me you'll send me.
Yes.